Welcome to Hope Talks. I'm Dr. Charles Montorio Archer, the President and CEO at One Hope United. Hope Talks are a conversation between industry experts and thought leaders around all issues pertaining to protecting children, strengthening families, and stabilizing communities. Today's guest is Bryan Echols. He is a senior advisor to the Illinois State Treasurer, and we'll be talking about strengthening community through investment and development. Welcome, Bryan.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be sitting here with you on the first day of Black History Month. It's a great way to open, so I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Thank you very much for being here, and I equally am excited as well. You know, Bryan, for the audience, tell us a little bit about who you are, what you're about, and what you've been doing.
Yeah, so my name is Bryan Echols. I am currently Senior Advisor to the Illinois State Treasurer, Michael Frerichs, and I do some consulting work. I teach a Social Justice Practicum at Adler University. The majority of my work, the last 20 years or so, has been around social justice. So now I am able to be in a position where I can leverage my banking and finance experience and my community development experience inside of the governmental space and guiding equitable financial practices. So I am an individual where my personal mantra is that I came to connect the dots. And one of the reasons that I do that, Doc, is because, you know, oftentimes I feel that we serve the same clients, if you will, and those individuals all access our various silos. But one thing that we miss is that the silos don't talk to each other. So a lot of the work that I have done is to bring unusual suspects to the same table because we serve the same people.
Absolutely, and that whole concept of connecting the dots kind of leads me to my first question. As a restorative justice practitioner, you've learned an introductory question that helps you frame your work, which I think is really fantastic. Can you share it with us and also tell us why that question is so important?
Absolutely. So many of you all have heard of Maasai warriors, right? Maasai warriors are known as being fierce lion hunters, and they have been doing so for thousands of years. Now, when we think about a lion hunter, right, we know that that individual is fierce, but one of their many greetings is basically translates in English to "How are the children?" And the reason that they ask that question, "How are the children?" is it is an indicator of where we are as a society. The question is asked thinking about the health and well-being of children and our society as a whole. So, you know, for a little over the last 15 years of my life, I have worked with young people in cities and nationally. And we've worked on and organized around a range of things, going from some of these young people being justice-involved youth. We've worked on education issues, improving education, zero tolerance policies, and our young people have advocated for housing, public safety, and improving mental health needs. And I think about this panel discussion that I attended in Washington, D.C. a few years ago. And it was a group, there were 5 young people on the panel, Doc, and they were all justice involved. And as they all told their stories that ranged from, you know, battery to weapons possessions to, you know, auto theft, battery, all of them were telling their stories and how they got into a life of crime. And one of the threads that I pulled out, Doc, that I don't think that it was very obvious to other individuals when they were talking, but all of them said that in their stories that they all did what they did to take care of or provide for a younger sibling because dad or mom and or both were incarcerated or addicted to crack. And when I think about that, they all committed crimes because they were hungry, right? Or they wanted to stop that pain of hunger for their siblings. And because we live in a society where young people have to be concerned about the basic needs like food, clothing, and shelter, it says to me potentially that our children are not well. Personally, Doc, I have 4 daughters who are all struggling with the isolation of COVID in their own ways. The older daughters are educated, gainfully employed, working in isolation. And if you can remember back to when you were, early 20s to 30s, Doc, like being a young professional and being able to be in community with your peers was very important. And, so I know that they're struggling. My 5-year-old started school, her daycare, preschool, and she loved her teachers, loved her classmates. And then COVID happened. And, for the first 6 to 8 months, she was making a mention of COVID and not being able to go back to school. And I bring all this up, Doc, because I recognize that, I see the mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual strain that our young people are dealing with. So again, the children aren't well today, Doc.
You bring up that question in and of itself is just so centered in what, child welfare is really all about, or social services and human services are all about, because we know that if you're unable to service the family unit, you're never going to reach that child. That's right. If that child is the center of it, you can't make impact unless you're actually reaching out and around to the entire family. So the children are centered, but then also there's this other theme that came up. And I think, I'm definitely going to have you come back on to talk about this particularly, because when we think about the causes of crime, there's been this thing that I've been reading about. It's become either need or greed. And what you just described was 5 people who needed something and only saw one way. So please be willing to come back to talk about that, because I really believe that just understanding how, if we don't get in front of servicing people in need, the connected dots that you're talking about leads to crime, and then leads to other things that we have to definitely think about. Absolutely. But through your work around strengthening communities, in your opinion, what is the state of community investment and development in under-resourced neighborhoods?
Yes. So what we know, Charles, is that Black families earn 58%. Just as an example, Black families earn 58% of what white families earn, and on average, white families have a net worth that is 10 times greater than that of African American families. And as I shared with you a few minutes ago, I've worked with young people to help them organize for basic needs, right? For basic things: education, housing, public safety, mental health, and kind of going back to those young people, those 5 young people who sat on the panel. We talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and then that lowest rung being food, clothing, shelter.
Yep.
What I have learned through my work is that food, clothing, and shelter is a privilege. We have some individuals who are striving to get to that next level, right? Like they are in survival mode. Food, clothing, and shelter is not a given. So, like you said, we have to go deeper than that. And when I think about some of the work that young people have done. They've even reached out to philanthropy and corporations to improve investments or to call attention to the need for investments in their communities. The harm has been generational. So the solution has to be generational as well if we're going to repair the harm that has been done. This harm, Doc, just didn't pop up. It's the result of decades, centuries of intentional systemic divestment and even dehumanization.
Mm-hmm. Tell me a
Right?
little bit about what's been your experience in Illinois and in Chicago. I know that you do have a breadth of things that you have seen and experienced over the last 50 years. Give me a little bit about what you see in your own backyard.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I think of all that, like the question is how do we repair that harm? And so currently I work with some of the city's largest banks to help address systemic racism as an example. And we're focusing our efforts on three pillars: workforce development, small business development, and then community investment. And, you know, through what launched that work was a very deep WBEZ story. And one of the things that it highlighted, Doc, was for every $1 that banks loaned in Chicago's white communities, they invested just 12 cents in the city's Black neighborhoods, 13 cents in the Latino neighborhoods. This is all an extension and a direct result of redlining and restrictive covenants. And, you know, Doc, my work is pretty much just one piece of a larger puzzle. And we collectively have to come out of, as I stated earlier, we have to come out of our silos and begin to work together. And because of that work, many of the financial institutions have made multi-million-dollar public, and in some cases even billions, public commitments to build a diverse pipeline that will range from frontline workers all the way up to the boards. And these are people that work in these banks and corporations, but more importantly, Doc, they're our neighbors, right? And their quality of work can have a direct impact in how they show up in our communities and for our communities where they live, thus having a direct impact on the lives of children, right? So there's a level of corporate social responsibility that's there, right?
You wind up having, you know, and sorry to cut you off for sure, but you wind up having people not fully understanding the need to get Black and brown and people of color in these positions, because the connected dot is they begin to see their own communities and the lack thereof, and should be drawing that line directly to local and Black and brown community investment. You know, you mentioned this piece about redlining.
Yes.
You know, we just went through the census over the last last year or so. You know, we've been talking about in Congress that redlining, or they're thinking about doing something this year that's going to kind of change the lines. What should people be paying attention to in that type of conversation, which will be a direct impact to community and community investment and development?
So, all right. So there's I want to hit this kind of in a roundabout way, Doc. So when I was young, I grew up in a home that created space for people in need. I never knew exactly what our financial situation was as a family, right? I come from old school people, right?
And business, don't ask.
Right? You know what I mean? It's like, you knew there's certain things you just don't ask about. But Doc, what I did know is that we were never hungry. We had a roof over our head. We had 2 cars to get us wherever we needed to get. And my parents created space for people who were in need in our home, right? At different points, we had extended family to stay in our home because then the need arose, right? And my parents tried to minimize, you know, the harm that divestment caused without me even knowing what they were doing. right? Like there was this collective thing that they all knew about, that they grew up in, the traditions that they grew up in. And so when we think about oppressive and legalized policies like redlining and restrictive covenants, many of our communities have been stuck in a time warp. That day, Doc, April 4th, 1968. That is the day that Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. And you can drive through certain communities on the west side, south side, and you can see those signs from stores that used to be there back in 1968. Those areas were strategically redlined. Divestment is still occurring in those communities, right? Where the banks go, where there is investment, other money follows it, right? And what decades of divestment caused is a concentration of poverty, inherited welfare, generational incarceration, and at times extreme intracommunal violence, and the endemic of drug addiction and the failed war on drugs, right? So during this hyper spiral, children and families were harmed, traumatized, separated, and even left behind. So that's where redlining as an example, restrictive covenants as an example, have left us.
When with everything you said is just examples of what happens when we don't concentrate investment in places where there is greater need. When we think about and this is why I also love talking to you, because it just makes me also think about other things that we probably want our audience to understand. Do you anticipate, with this new influx of Black and brown people into Congress, Illinois has a speaker who's Black, you even see other positions throughout the country, do you foresee, in your opinion, that we might be on the verge of some different community investment that hopefully leads to at least more awareness about why communities need what they need?
It's funny. You may have caught a slight smile on my face when you were saying that, because in my mind, for those of us who had the ability, the opportunity to watch Hamilton, being in the room where it happens matters, right? And if I am not right? If we are not in the room where it's happening, there is no one there to really tell our story the way that we could tell our story. I think about, one thing that I'm proud of right now, Doc. I used to coordinate the community restorative justice hubs. And one of the things that I was interested in is, how do we bring a restorative framework into how legislation happens, right, to repair harm? And, this was something that I embarked upon back in, 2017 or so. And right now, under the new speaker and under the new committees, there is a restorative justice committee, right? So, I don't know if they will approach legislation from the perspective of being restorative, repairing harm, but that's something that, I think about. And when I think about, people who look like us, Doc, who are now in these places to make systemic policy change and, sound recommendations, I would imagine that we will see a shift. The Illinois Black Caucus just passed a very robust legislative agenda. So when we are in the place to do that, some things can happen where, it's natural that we're thinking about our families and our children. So I'm hopeful that that happens with the new legislators coming in.
I'm equally very, very hopeful, because I think there's this thing in our culture, it's probably lived for years, but those of us who really understand what progress is slow.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
it's the smaller wins and identifying that the opportunities that come and us being willing to jump into those opportunities and take them. And when I think about Hope Talks, I also think about the work that I'll do at One Hope United and in this industry or sector. It really has to be, am I trying to change the policies and regulations that perpetuate the same, or am I looking to shift it so that way there could be a bigger table for all of us to kind of sit on and affect the change that we want to see in the communities?
Absolutely.
But it leads me to my next question. So we are naturally drawn to identifying issues or challenges. However, what do you find to be the area where we should concentrate on for solutions? And then what is that implementation process?
So, as I mentioned, I am a restorative justice practitioner. And one of the things that we say in restorative justice is the wisdom is always in the room.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So with that being the case, we have to create space for our young people to speak up and speak truth to power. We have to be conscious about our adultism, right? Like, you and I probably came from a time and a place where young people were supposed to be seen and not heard.
Absolutely.
And that hasn't boded too well to some degree, right? Like, you think about Dr. King, who was a young person when he began his journey of nonviolence activism, right? Mid-20s, right? And stayed on the path and literally, ushered in voting rights, ushered in civil rights, introduced a poor people's campaign that involved, Black, brown, poor white people across the country to have an equitable space at the table. And, with that in mind, like, what if all the systems, Doc, that we know that exist in America, what if they all started to ask the question, how are the children? Before they created policy. We would have to connect the dots and kind of challenge these systems to look at things outside their silos. And systems always, have to ask, how are the children? How are our most vulnerable children? And I think that if we could begin to approach things in that manner, trusting that the person who is often the object of policy potentially has a better policy, right? And if we just created that space, I think we would be on a good path towards an implementation process that is just, that is equitable, and that will create opportunities for our most marginalized. And really, we could see an improvement in our families and our children, which is ultimately what matters most, because at the root, what makes a community healthy is the individual. The healthy individual is a microcosm of the community at large.
One thing that stands out is the wisdom is in the room. Like, just think about, it's the reason why you always want to live experience in the room when you're talking about a regulation or policy, because there's wisdom in what I experience, and not just wisdom in, you being able to connect a dollar to a practice without understanding how it really does affect, a lived experience. So this is my last question. I ask every guest this one question, but I also think for you on this day, for us in this moment, it will probably mean something more. And that question is, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope? What gives me hope is my daughters, man. They're amazing. And I know that with them being able to influence the spaces that they're in, that the people who are around them are better for knowing them. And on a larger scale, right? Literally, I am thinking about just the millennials and some of the young people who I have trained, who are growing into adulthood, early, young adults, and who are making impact on society, ranging from the military to the arts world to music to culture. The framework that we gave them when they were young, that they're still carrying it. Some of them are parents, and they are teaching their children some of the things that we taught them. And what I'm teaching them is what my parents taught me, about taking care of the least of us, always thinking about the less fortunate, always being willing to serve. That gives me hope.
I really, really want to thank you, Bryan, for coming on today. I can see that we can have this conversation for hours, but I also want to be able to have you come back and talk about a lot of the other things that we didn't get a chance to highlight today, and hopefully you'll be willing to do that.
Doc, I would be honored to sit down and speak with you again, and I pray you many blessings over your Hope Talks, and that these episodes will inspire people, and create this spirit of communal cooperation. That's what I'm hopeful for.
Yeah, thank you very much. So to all the guests who are watching this for the first time, I hope you do decide to register. Follow us on all of our social media outlets. We will be talking about hope, because hope will actually lift us out of every situation. And I'm really glad to have guests like Bryan Echols be with us today, and look forward to all the other guests that will be here. So thank you for checking this episode out, and I look forward to seeing you for future Hope Talks. Thank you.